very much, Catherine, for the tremendous amount of work that you've done in getting all of us together and getting this panel organized for today, along with your busy uh, academic schedule in a very difficult pandemic environment. I also want to thank Dr. Andrew Mead and Lila Mead for their stewardship and co-chairing of the Vassar Haiti project and the work that they've done, at least in the 2 decades that I've been here at Vassar. It's been a project that has not only enriched Vassar culturally, done some very good supportive work for Haiti, but it has also been a project that has been an excellent mentoring and training vehicle for students who are interested in not only Haiti, Caribbean, but larger issues of development across the world. So let me thank all of you for the work that you have done. Let me start by saying, like all of the regions of the world, the Caribbean has not been spared from the COVID pandemic. As of today, the region has 529,397 recorded cases of COVID. The Dominican Republic is the hardest hit Caribbean country with 239,617 cases and 3,100 deaths. Haiti and Jamaica, 2 countries that you would hear a lot about today, have 12,488 cases, 249 deaths, and 23,263 cases and 422 deaths, respectively. Yes, Haiti has 12,000 cases. Jamaica has recorded 23,000 cases. So these, by global standards and by even the Caribbean standards, seem reasonably or comparatively low. So whilst the recorded COVID-19 infections and death have been comparatively low in Haiti, Jamaica, and indeed in the majority of Caribbean countries, the pandemic has triggered a severe and unprecedented economic crisis in the region, according to the Inter-American Development Bank. In Haiti, this crisis has widened the social and political gulf between different segments of the society and has produced a new cycle of impoverishment, grievances, and violent political protests. Our distinguished panelists, all of whom have very deep roots in the Caribbean, will help us today reflect on the challenges and opportunities presented by the pandemic in the region. So let me start by introducing the panelists very briefly. Please check out the Vassar Haiti project website for more extensive information on them. I have placed the website on the chat list so that you can access the website through the chat list. Our first panelist today is Dr. Carole Berotte. She is Professor Emerita of Social Linguistics and past president of Bronx Community College and Massachusetts Bay Community College. Professor Joseph will provide a brief historical context situating the educational system in Haiti. She would also discuss Haiti's socio-linguistic reality and its impact on language policy in the country and other diasporic communities. Our second panelist is Dr. Mamyrah Dougé-Prosper, who is a visiting professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College. Professor Dougé-Prosper will discuss popular education approaches, especially in social movement organizations in Haiti. She will particularly center non-normative social categories, especially LGBTQ people, women, and peasants. Our third panelist, Dr. Kimberly Williams-Brown, is a professor of education at Vassar College. Professor Brown will speak on some of the challenges in education, healthcare, employment, and the increasing impoverishment facing the Caribbean region. She will also speak about the opportunities being presented by the Caribbean community, CARICOM, as well as the resilience and the community spirit of the people in the region. Each panelist will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes maximum. We will then have a 25 to 30 minutes presentation of questions, comments, and answers. Please place any question or comments that you have in the Q&A box. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Dr. Joseph for the first presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Rashid. It's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you this evening. And I am really excited to hear my other colleagues and have a wonderful discussion. My presentation is basically about education, immigration, and schooling. And so I'll start by saying that Haitians are not new to the United States. For example, as early as the 1500s, Haitians came to North America. And most of us know of the more recent migrations, but Haitians have come and fought in the American Revolution and participated in a lot of the development of the United States. And they have actually lived in every city, have done every job that you can think of, and have organized themselves. And in spite of all of this industriousness, they have been victims of stereotyping and prejudice. In 1791, free mulattoes and slaves arrived to the United States, some of them with their slave owners. So that was essentially the first wave. The second wave was during the American occupation of Haiti between 1915 and 1934. So for 19 years, the US occupied Haiti, and a lot of Haitians left after that, many of them living in Harlem and participating in the Harlem Renaissance. So some of them wanted to join the Marcus Garvey movement of going back to Africa. Others joined the Communist Party, like Jacques Oumet, and wanted to explore that possibility for Haiti. The major migrations to the United States and other parts of the world came after 1957, when Papa Doc Duvalier rose to power and left the country devastated and ruled by really an iron fist, so that so many people left as political refugees. The middle class, the educated Haitians, mostly left during that time. And so the fourth and fifth wave came under Baby Doc, who was his son, who took over after him. And since 1991, the coup against Aristide continued this kind of instability, embargo by the United States, and a lot of instability caused by a lot of the imperialistic actions. And so to understand Haiti and to understand what happens in education and with the use of languages, one has to understand a little bit of that history and the migration. So as of 1918, French was the official language of Haiti. And until recently, in the 1979, with the Réforme Bernard, who was a minister of education, Haitian Creole became co-official. So in the current constitution of 1987, both languages exist side by side. But for a long time, a lot of people thought that Haitians were bilingual and spoke French and Creole. And I recall in the public schools in New York City, for example, French bilingual programs were put in place to meet the needs of Haitian students. And to everybody's surprise, these kids were not understanding. And so to understand the context, in Haiti itself, even though the Constitution says that education is free and available, education is really not available as it should be to all citizens. So between 70 and 80% of the schools are basically private schools. Some of them run by the Catholic churches and the Protestant churches, but most schools are private. So which means that the 30% that basically the government runs that are public are really not adequate and not sufficient to meet the needs of the population in Haiti. When you have a system like that, and where you have children speaking Creole at home and coming to school and having school in French, it's like they're coming to a foreign country. So here in the United States, for example, when children of immigrant groups arrive, we provide ESL, English as a second language, and in some cases, some districts provide bilingual education, dual language. It's labeled differently depending on what the program offers, but we expect children to learn in the language they speak. Yet in Haiti, for centuries, this has not been the case. So you can imagine if you have that kind of a system, what happens. Although Creole is used and spoken by everyone, it is not used widely in the schools. I had the opportunity to work in Haiti in 2015 to 2018 with different schools and visited schools throughout the country. And it was clear that even though the Ministry of Education would have a national mandate saying that schooling should be done in Creole, and at least the first 4 years, that most of the schools were not implementing that. And when you asked why they weren't, they would say things like, oh, the parents don't want it, or we really have all our books in French, we don't have materials in Creole. So having developed materials and worked in schools in the United States, where in the late 70s, bilingual education became an option for immigrant children, I know that materials are available. And in fact, in the schools in Haiti, many of the materials that were used in the schools in the United States were actually used there. So the Creole language was supposed to be the language of instruction since the Bernard reform of the 1979s. And it was recommended that Creole be used the first 4 years of instruction to at least give children a chance to transition possibly into French. In the US, these programs, as I said, started in French, but then evolved into Creole as we realized that the majority of the children coming were not French speakers. So in addition to looking at the linguistic aspect of education, we also need to take into consideration the cultural context. And as I used to say, and I still say, language and culture is not like a coat that we put on and take off when we feel like it. So our culture and our language is very much a part of our identity, a part of who we are. And asking kids to come to school to completely forget who they are and try to function in a language that is basically a second language for them is, in my view, criminal. It is not education because we are not providing the opportunity for these children to be able to come and use the language that they know, think in the language that they know, and use the resources that their culture provides them. So the real difference then is not just providing a bilingual education. Bilingual education started in the United States, as I said, in the 70s, with the historic landmark decision of Lau versus Nichols, where 1,800 children of Chinese ancestry a case in San Francisco where the denial and use of their language was found to be illegal. And so that was when the movement started in bilingual education for all the language groups. So when you have a system in Haiti where 70 to 80% of the schools are private, which means parents have to pay, parents have to buy all the materials, buy the books, you cannot expect people to be able to afford that. So children go to school for the most part up to the 6th grade. And after that, you have a big fall off of numbers of children who make it to the secondary schools. So the numbers continue to dwindle, and children are continuously weeded out. It is not a system where you come in and you expect to be successful. It's a system where you're expected to be weeded out. And we hear numbers vary between 10% and 5% actually make it out of secondary schools, and 1% go to the university. So University of Haiti was established in the late 40s and cannot accommodate the number of students who have to go to school. So it was in 1988 that UNIQ, University of Quisqueya, was established to meet those needs, because we realized that most of our kids, the successful ones who are able to make it through that system, were leaving and going to school either in the United States, in France, in Canada, and a great number to the Dominican Republic next door. So when one looks at the inequities that already existed in the system, and you look at now with COVID and other challenges, of course, many of the private schools are doing like we're doing in the United States and elsewhere, and providing instruction virtually. So again, it's a question of resources. The parents and the families that are able to provide laptops or pads for their kids, they're able to connect with their schools and get their work done. The children of the poor then don't have access. And with the recent instability in Haiti, the political unrest, it makes it very difficult to have any kind of continuation in schooling. So in thinking about, what kind of education or what kind of language policy would be needed to be put in place, there are several of us who've been continuously thinking about this. It was until the 1980s that the first symposium on the Creole language was held in New York City, where educators gathered to discuss exactly, what it is that we were proposing to do. And again, not just focusing on the issue of language and materials, but also on inclusion of culture in this kind of instruction. And so, Sonia, if you could share the screen for me now. There's a chart that I'd like to share with you that a group of us have envisaged in terms of categories that would be necessary if Haiti is to get out of the impasse that it is now. It is in Creole, so I will translate that. We find that we need to look at language and a system of education in 3 categories. So category 1 would be the national category, where Creole is the language of instruction and the official language. And all activities that are taking place in the country need to be in Creole. No one would have the right to be able to present documents and things in other languages that people really couldn't understand. So already we know that 1 in 4 people, and maybe even more, who are living actually in the Caribbean basin speak Creole, the Haitian Creole. So it is not really something that should be discussed to death about, what it is we need to do in order to really educate. The second category is called a regional category, And if you could bring the chart up a little bit, Sonia, then they could also look at the diagram, because you see Creole is in the red and is on top. And in the regional, it would be that the history and geography, would allow us of Haiti would allow us then to treat 4 other languages as necessary for education in Haiti. So we would need to teach French as a transition for Haitians, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And why these 4? Because French, we know the tradition already from history. English, because English is an international language now, and everybody around the world wants to know English. It's the language of commerce and business. Spanish, because most of our neighbors speak Spanish. Our immediate neighbor, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba. And Portuguese, because of late, Haitians have been going to Brazil in great numbers. And so Haitians are returning to Haiti in great numbers. And there are great numbers of Brazilians living in Haiti, in fact. So those 4 languages would have to be part of any kind of educational system that we would want to think about for a new Haiti, for a Haiti that would become more prosperous and better educated. And the third one has to do with languages around the world. And those would be opportunities given to Haitian youngsters to develop competencies in 8 of these any of these 8 languages would make sense. So for example, Swahili, Amharic, Lingala, Arab, Mandarin, Hindi, Russian, and German. So why these languages? Well, some of the languages already have roots in Haiti, in that there are ethnic groups that speak them. But when we look at the numbers around the world, it makes a lot of sense for the development of a young Haitian who would be a world citizen, well educated, to speak some of these languages. So Swahili, for example, is spoken in 6 different nations, 191 million people. Arabic, 453 million in 22 nations. And there is an Arab community, mostly of Lebanese descendants in Haiti. Amharic, 115 million people. Lingala, 91 million. German, 84 million, and there are Haitians of German descent. Russian, 146 million people. Hindi, 1,400,000,000 people in the world. And Mandarin, of course, 1,500,000 people speaking those languages. So those are huge numbers of people around the world that speak those languages. So it would make sense for an educational system that gets revamped in Haiti to look at language policies that would encourage first instruction in Creole, and then a transition to the 4 immediate languages, and then access to another world language. So I think I'll stop there and take questions when the time comes.
Thank you very much, Professor Joseph. I'll turn to Professor Dougé-Prosper.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. And just a quick correction, Dougé-Prosper, but yes, it's the, and it's exactly to the point of Dr.
Dougé, sorry.
No, it's totally fine. No offense. I just want, we're talking about language, so it was like fitting to bring that up. And I think there's going to be some synergy in some of what I'm saying and some of what Dr. Joseph has brought up for us. And I think it's great that you've laid out this context for me ahead of time, so folks will, this will sound familiar already. So my work is mostly on social movements in Haiti, and as it relates to education, looking at how they do popular education, and to the point that Dr. Joseph brought up for us, right? That if education is very difficult to access, right, then people have to figure out how to do or do the work of the state, right? And so I was interested in connecting to this conversation about education. This is part of my work. And I wanted to share with you some of the field work that I've done in the past that's leading up to the book project, but that I wanted to focus in on these specific snapshots that I think set up the conversation well that I'm hoping to have with you. And the first one takes place in Limonade on April 4th, 2013. And the first meeting opened up with a prayer. Everyone stood, and only the believers bowed their heads. And the coordinator of the meeting thanked Jesus for the safe travels of all those present and asked him to assist everyone in our work over the next 3 days, because these were workshops happening over 3 days, and I'll explain more. She said, Amen. The crowd followed suit, Amen. And then she invited listeners to breakfast, right? Milk, coffee, chocolat pays, right? Mamba, so peanut butter, right, in Mamba. And smiling, she proudly announced that the peanut butter was a product of her women's collective. I'll talk a little bit about that group in a bit. And insisted, right, that consuming locally produced foods, right, protects us from GMOs and from acculturation, right? So our remaining meals of the day were also, right, Creole foods, du collé, poule pays, banane pesée, etc., right, for lunch. And for supper, right, had some sort of oatmeal before closing with another prayer. And, I want you to follow with me these snapshots, right, and what I'm hoping that you will see in these moments. So there's a second snapshot, and it's in La Coma, which is in the northeast of Haiti, on April 2013. And the meeting room was set up with chairs, forming a semicircle around the facilitators' tables, which was draped with a large Haitian flag. On an adjacent table, a young woman carefully put on display her collective's well-packaged hair pomades of carrot and ginger for sale. And it was Sambaz, and he's a singer, his turn to intervene, and he decried, right, the shunning of peasants from the nation, were further invisibilized, right, and risk destruction with the advent of what he called, like, quote unquote, modernity. He then pointed to education and religion as sources of the peasants' alienation from nature. Says, young people don't want to work the land anymore, right? They want to live in the city so they can sit and work in offices. So then, right, Samba interrupted and broke out in song. And I want to share some of the song with you. Let's see. I can move this around.
1814, esclavio bataille, point d'indépendation. 1814, esclavio bataille, point d'indépendation. Ça qui travaille, c'est pas yo qui récolté. Bébé yo qui parte dans bataille là, c'est yo qui péjouissé.
So I'll stop the song, right? So the quote is, and this is the title of the song, and he's part of a group called Awuzam. And right, it says that in 1804, the slaves fought for their independence. Those who were present, right, did not reap the benefits. But those who were absent, right, who were rejoicing. So these are some of the things, right, that were taking place at these different meetings. The third snapshot is in Petite Rivière de la Tibonite, and it also takes place in April 2013. Right, as the breakout session groups reconvened in the larger gathering, some participants complained about being served by spaghetti for breakfast and said this was inauthentic, right? We should be consuming rice, millet, or wheat that is produced in the region. One participant reminded the disgruntled crowd that they had not attended the workshop for the snacks, right? And even said that these malicious NGOs have broken the back of social movements as a result of offering food to poor people in exchange for attendance. Like, we are not here to eat. And after the official debriefing, right, of these meetings, right, people get to talk about, right, what are their visions for Haiti? So these snapshots were taken after, right, 3 days of, 3 sets of 3-day retreats that took place in Limonade, La Coma, Petite Rivière, during which 30 to 40 women and men from community-based organizations in various cities and towns in the department of Nord, Nord-Est, Nord-Ouest, and Artibonite gathered in April 2013 to engage in a transformative process of co-learning and co-teaching to address the inequalities that order their lives as peasants. Another set of meetings would take place in the fall of 2013 in the South, followed by a nationwide convocation. Local organizations convened throughout the northern region of Haiti to formulate what they're calling, right, a cahier revendication that would outline regional grievances and, most importantly, list corresponding demands to the state. They envisioned the notebooks culminating into multiple work sessions with Parliament. Parliament does not exist anymore today, in order to create just and appropriate laws that not only protect the rights of peasants as a special group, but also that aim to integrate rural populations in national decision-making processes. And this was particularly important, right? This is in light of the 2011 amendment of the Constitution of 1987 that Dr. Joseph talked to us about. This is in light of the 10th anniversary of the presence of the United Nations Civilization Mission in Haiti, which is felt for these groups of people as an occupation, right? And it was a centennial of the first US occupation, and also the 2016 elections that brought about the current president, who's, controversial election of 2016. Right, so the social movements were calling for a return to constitutional order and popular sovereignty, right? And this is part of the efforts of putting this notebook to say, this is what we have to say, right? Part of what Dr. Joseph is saying, if the system is ignoring folks, right, and folks are going to then organize themselves, right, and bring the solutions forth. And so this notebook process was organized by, a series of organizations on the ground, particularly a group that I think, is extremely, it's made up of many folks like us, right? Like scholars who want to be able to do research that accompany movement, right? To be tools for more advocacy and more organizing, right? And just thinking about the alternatives, especially in light of an absent state, right? And so essentially this particular think tank, PAPTA is the acronym, Plateforme Haïtienne Plaidoyer pour un Développement Alternatif. So it's all about, right, how do we imagine an alternative development to what already is? And they had initiated this process several times, and there were, as Dr. Joseph point, right, several reasons why they had to wait until 2013. And they actually didn't complete the whole process until 2018, right? They did it regionally and then nationally. And I'll share with you, afterwards, and give you a sense of the where they are with this work. But essentially, because of these delays, right, as I said, it took them a while, but they were able to apply this participatory action research method to foster dialogue and establish a common vocabulary, right, with attendees, the people who participated. And so I'm interested in my work in looking at how movement narratives are constructed, right, or co-constructed by leaders and people who are part of, right, these organizations, and the importance of the kind of narratives about history, the present, and future, right, that they're constructing. And so what was very interesting that came out of these 3-day retreats, as far as concerns our conversation here about education, was how they understood or reconstructed or went in conversation with participants about what the past was. And much like Dr. Joseph did for us when she talked about the different migrations, right, and gave us a sense of the history of Haiti, right, we see that there's a way that these particular groups reconstructed and reframed the past, right? And specifically the role of Vodou. And this colonial past, of course, is presented as, right, a polarized past between French-speaking, right, as Dr. Joseph was saying, French-speaking Christian white plantation owners, right, and mulatto, quote unquote, affranchis, against a nascent Black Creole-speaking Vaudouisan nation of small farming, right, slaves, you know, who would become peasants. And essentially this is how they understood, right, this colonial past, and that this alliance between, right, the affranchis and the owners would essentially come to stand against them, right? And this is part of the setup that they understand as far as the post-colonial past, right? Right after the revolution, what happens? And we see that land gets concentrated in the hands of what they call, right, the grand large landowners. And essentially, right, the people who were previously enslaved become what we call here, right, sharecroppers. So this is part of the history that they're constructing, right? Like their genealogy and how they understood, right, the struggles historically. And of course, right, a discussion about the US occupation and how it came to, right, give the kind of reality that folks are living in Haiti, right? And so the next thing is about, right, the second day, right? So the second day was more focused, not longer about the past, but about the present. So, right, we moved from sort of a romanticization of the past and understanding of the past with this conflict, and particularly uplifting of Vodou and Vodou as a place, right, that is problematic, that is unproblematically cast as a pre-capitalist past in which the peasant is the story. And the Lakou is the organizing principle. And we can talk more about what the Lakou, right, the real Lakou and the theoretical Lakou, right, that they're invoking this image. And day two is more focused around talking about the revolution 1986, right, ousting the Duvalier dictatorship. It's more about what's happened with the neoliberal turn, how it's turned Haiti into a food-dependent country, right? And the promotion of collectivism, of solidarity economies, Combit style farming. And again, Vodou here is invoked as a religion, right? Freedom of religion is how it's captured in the Constitution. So in the past, Vodou is a way of life and resistance. In the present, Vodou is a religion. And what I saw in terms of the vision for the future, which is what we spent time talking about on the third day, and I'll end there, is that Vodou becomes sort of secularized, right? They're no longer talking about Vodou, but about the way of life that we could come to think about as Vodou in terms of family-based agriculture, right? Stewardship of the land and not ownership of the land. Women and men share power, food sovereignty, right? The working together. And this is part of how, this is part of what I wanted to share with you about some of the popular education that's happening outside of the traditional schooling system that, as Dr. Joseph said, right, has failed. And I just wanted to show you, this is for the North, this is what the final product ended up being. And I can answer question more about the content, because I talked more about the process that led to this. But yeah, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions. Time goes by so quickly.
Thank you very much. Again, I'm going to try not to butcher your name, Professor Dougé-Prosper. Let me turn over to my colleague, Professor Kim Williams-Brown.
Thank you, Professor Rashid. Good evening, everybody. Thank you to the organizers, especially to Sonia and Catherine, who have really done a lot to pull this panel together, but to all the labor for all the folks who pulled this together, folks that I'm aware of and folks that I'm just not aware of. It really is an honor to be on a panel with the two panelists who just spoke and the moderator. I've already learned just so much just listening and thinking with you. And so tonight my remarks are going to be, I think, probably more overarching than they are specific. So it's really great that you both really focused in on Haiti in that way. And I'm going to try to do something a little broader. Hopefully it works. So As part of what I was thinking about as I thought about this panel and thought about the work, or what I would say, is just how much conversation there is about access to vaccines and to testing. And really in the Caribbean, right, the questions about not having access to vaccines, while it seems like developed countries like the US are hoarding the access, right, to these vaccines. And so Professor Rashid, I was really happy when you talked about some of the numbers there, because I had a graphic which I won't show because it does much of the same thing that you did in your earlier remarks about the numbers, the percentages of folks who have contracted COVID in the Caribbean, right? And to think about those small spaces and to think about what that means in regards to access. So for example, Jamaica, right, is expected to get vaccines in the coming weeks, and they're readying themselves and preparing nurses and the healthcare professionals to administer them. And while in the US though, right, we've had access for months, right, supposedly. Although, right, if you're on the ground, the reality is that for Black, Indigenous, people of color, old people, folks who are in rural places, we know that this access is actually really fraught, right? That the question of access, the perceptions of what this means, and the resulting attitudes are important for understanding the socio-historic meanings of access to resources just generally. So I want to spend my time really thinking about these questions. As a scholar, I spend a large part of my time thinking transnationally, thinking about transnational relationships and diasporas. So I lean really heavily tonight on Chandra Talpade Mohanty's work that frames transnational feminist understandings beyond borders or crossings, right? Her frame allows us to understand that some of the same apparatuses that organize one's life in the third world and this are the same apparatuses that organizes one's life in the first world. And here I'm not invoking first or third as these kind of geographic or economic terms, right? But as political terms, as she uses them. What this means then, right, is that there's always a here and there's always a there, but the here is always there, right, in transnational terms, and the there is always here. So, for example, hold on, sorry. So by contemporary examples, right, like Hurricane Katrina, right, when that happened, there are folks, right, largely in Louisiana, who talked about that space looking like the third world, right, and inspired Kanye West to say something like, George Bush hates Black people. So even more recently, right, this example of Texas, right, with the issues that they recently had with the ice storm, people were saying the same thing. This looks like a third world country, right? So the reverberations of this kind of access to a variety of different things in both of those examples, right? Different kinds of access, but around disasters, right? When thinking about particular populations, how that access, even in the developed world, even in this first world nation, right? How that becomes really fraught. So the idea of a diaspora is loosely to imagine a space that culturally, physically, and politically connects people across borders, space, and time. So I want to suggest then that because of the political, and I'm thinking here about big P politics and little p politics, of the situatedness of Blackness, the connections of inequality, inequity, and in access resonates across the Black Caribbean, right, in similar ways. It also resonates in the Latinx Caribbean, with Indigenous folks in the Caribbean, and with non-white folks, right, both in the Caribbean and across spaces in these first world developed nations. So as a transnational feminist scholar, what I read into all of these scenarios, right, are a few things. That BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color, are disproportionately affected by disasters in first and third world countries, right? That poor and working class people are disproportionately affected by disasters and pandemics in both spaces. That women, cis and trans, are disproportionately affected by disasters and pandemics in first and third world countries. And the fourth thing is that politics always mitigates access. So in that way, some part of the first world and the third world always operates similarly, right? So with that framing, I'm going to spend the rest of my time really thinking about Jamaica. The other panelists really spoke specifically about Haiti. And so I want to talk a little bit about Jamaica for the remaining time. So we know, right, that the Caribbean is not a monolith. Jamaica and Haiti are not the same country, right, by any stretch, right? Many countries in the Caribbean are not structured in the same way. Their politics are different. They're connected regionally, but there are huge differences in terms of these countries and what they represent, and the people and the food and the diversity in a variety of ways. It is a vast geographic region, and it cannot be collapsed into this kind of Caribbean identity, right? So much so that even the way COVID impacts these spaces, and this is where I was going to show the graph, but Professor Rashid did that work earlier, the way COVID has affected them, it looks really different, right? So in a place like Jamaica, 23,000 contractions, right? There was a moment when because so many of the spaces inhabited there are rural, that the amount of folks contracting the virus was really low. Now for them, it seems really high. So in your remarks, Professor Rashid, you talked about it being low, but for Jamaicans, right, they feel like, right, these numbers, given the size of the population, about 3 million, just feels really, really high, right? And it feels like COVID is out of control there. So what COVID has done is that it's confirmed the inequities that we either knew existed or we felt viscerally, right? So in Jamaica, for example, access to education through technology, and both panelists before spoke about this a little bit. So through tablets, computers, smartphones, all of those things become really difficult, right? When people live in either really rural places or people are poor, right? They live in poverty, and so access to the physical devices themselves, and then access to the data to be able to get online, to participate in school is really, really difficult. There's an inability to afford any of these things, right? And then there's also this consideration of multiple users of computers in a home, all of these things that further complicate what it means to have access. So these issues, of course, are not unique to Jamaica, right? And in fact, in Poughkeepsie, New York, where I live and teach, these issues also exist in many of the communities that surround the campus. One of the personal examples that I have about Jamaica is that recently I sent a tablet to my 4-year-old third cousin, who's more like a nephew. He's my daughter's age. And so I sent him a computer and a tablet because that's what his grandmother asked for. But when he got it, neither the grandmother nor the mom could use the tablet, right? Or the computer. And his grandmom runs a shop bar, right? This is how she makes her living. And so it's not possible to be with him during the day. So even though he had access, right? He has family abroad, right? In this first world space that could send these things to him, he was still not able to access the education, right? Because, right, access is always fraught because it's always mitigated by these other things that are happening. So we know this, and it sounds familiar because in the US, right, in the US space, we know that there are these kinds of things happening in similar ways, in similar spaces, right? So when we think about diaspora or we think about transnational understandings, we begin to get a sense, right, that these things are constructed against a larger colonial narrative, right? Neo-colonial narrative now, but that they're not unique. They become amplified, right, in BIPOC communities. Healthcare is always precarious, right? In a place like Jamaica, if you can afford access to private hospitals, then there's a slight chance, and I mean really slight chance, that you might be able to get fast and reliable care. But if you're not able to access private care, the public option is sometimes honestly deadly, right? So recently, my best friend's mom was sick. She lives in a rural area. She was actually unconscious at one point. And my friend who's in London was calling ambulance services for a very long time. And for 27 hours, nobody showed up for her. In fact, at one point, one of the ambulance services said, we really only respond when somebody dies. So call us back when she dies, right? Like this kind of just laissez-faire attitude about sickness in general. And it wasn't COVID. She did not have COVID. But as you can imagine, right, COVID has made healthcare access even harder, even more precarious, because the infrastructure itself was already unstable. In New York City, however, the ambulance might get to you. It may not take 27 hours, right? But what might be really painful for you later or really deadly is that you might be paying for this ambulance ride for the rest of your life, right? Potentially, it could bankrupt you to have an ambulance come get you, or, right, you might die anyway, because once you show up in the space as a Black person or an Indigenous person or a person of color, that they may not take your pain seriously, or they may not take you seriously, period, right? So these disparities in BIPOC communities sound similar because the same conditions of racism and poverty structure them across the borders of developed and developing countries. So finally, when you think about, right, remittances and the ways in which Caribbean countries stay afloat because, right, people send money back home, and that this is not happening, what does that mean for all of the things that I spoke about before? What does it mean for education? What does it mean for the healthcare sector? What does it mean, right, to not be able to have access to remittances? According to the World Bank, remittances will drop by 14% in 2021 across the world, and in the Caribbean, it will drop by 8%. So this means that poverty rates are going to rise, and that means that crime rates are going to rise, right? And in fact, in Jamaica, the crime rate is already really high, right? And there's a direct relationship between the hardships that people are facing and, right, the high levels of crime that is also happening in that space. So it seems like a really dire picture, right, for low and middle income Caribbean countries that may have already been struggling with IMF bills and other sociopolitical factors that make life really difficult. But the story in the Caribbean is never hopeless, right? It's never hopeless. There's always a story of resistance here. And so despite COVID and other factors, these stories of resistance and hope, right, always emerge. And so I end by thinking about some of these spaces of resistance and hope and some of the ways in which people have been working to address some of these issues that I laid out in the beginning. So the first group is the Economic Commission for Latin American and the Caribbean and Caribbean countries, which is a group that has been thinking about a gendered approach to understanding how COVID has impacted folks in the Caribbean, right? So how are women faring under COVID? And we know, right, and I set this up earlier, that women and other folks are always really vulnerable in these situations, right? CARICOM, the body that spearheads economic and other programs from member states, member countries in the Caribbean, they're also doing some work to really think about the impacts, right, of COVID on the Caribbean region. And these spaces are, not as radical for sure, not as born out of resistance, right, by any stretch. These are political groups, right? But they're at least beginning to think about the ways in which they can interrupt some of these cycles. A more political group that exists outside of Jamaica, a group called Jamaicans for Justice, right? They're fighting legal and social battles to really think about what it means to help folks begin to recover from the economic depression and just all the ways in which COVID has ravaged folks across the Caribbean. So these organizations, right, are just a few of many that are paying attention to the precarity of this moment, and they're continuing to do work on behalf of the citizens of the Caribbean. The Caribbean, I like to think, right, is a fugitive space. It's a space of resistance. It's a place that refuses to die, right? And the same spirit of resistance, I think, right, that propelled Haiti forward, right, to become independent, to become the first state to abolish slavery, to start a new economy on its own terms, right, is the same spirit that allows, right, Caribbean people to keep fighting with any and all adversity that emerge, right, and to come out really strong and as victorious. Carole Boyce Davies, in her book, Caribbean Spaces, says, right, that Haiti is a halo, right, that beckons and calls to folks across the Caribbean, right, reminding us of the ways in which when Black people, right, are part of the equation, how difficult life can be, right, the kinds of struggles that Black folks face in diaspora, but also, right, this bright light, this hope, right, that people are resistant. They're always resistant. There's always fighting that's happening in these spaces, right? And that we have to look for the moments, we have to look for the programs, we have to think about all the ways in which, for example, the two panelists before me really talked about the work that they're doing in the Haitian space and the work that's happening in Jamaica to make, right, these spaces better spaces for all the citizens who live there. Thanks for listening, and I appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to the questions that you will ask.
Thank you very much to all three panelists. We're now open for any questions or comments. We also welcome comments. If you have comments and you want to join in the conversation, please do. But we would just ask you to make your comments, if they're comments, very, very brief, so that other people would have the opportunity to join in. So you can raise your hand, or you can, we have a question from Carole. Carole, do you want to pose your question live? Yeah. So
Hi there.
Yeah.
Can people
Carole,
hear me?
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank all of the panelists for being with us this evening, but in spirit of keeping things brief, I think my question was more geared towards Dr. Brown. And I was just wondering, in light of COVID, but also recent natural disasters and likely more frequent natural disasters, what does future protection for vulnerable BIPOC look for you, and specifically for women, like in this next kind of stage of resistance in the Caribbean? And I really, it really resonated with me that you said that the Caribbean is a space of resistance. And so I was wondering, how do foreign orgs kind of consider their positionality in terms of either bolstering this resistance that's taking place in the Caribbean now? And do we kind of have to shift the way that we see our responsibility to people in the Caribbean, especially at a time like right now?
Thank you very much, Carole. We'll take another question from Charles. Charles, do you want to pose your question?
This is an immediate economic question. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Between September 30 and October 2nd, 2020, the gourd US dollar exchange rate fell from 106, not 196, 106 to 63. It's now 77. Why? And what does this do to the value of remittances sent from the US to Haiti? And what does it do to the budget of an NGO, which is funded in US dollars and that maybe has to buy artwork in Haiti?
Thank you very much, Charles. So we'll take those two questions. The first question is directed to Prof. Kim, but if the other panelists want to join in and comment, that's also welcome.
Absolutely, thank you for that. I'll take a stab. And for me, I think one's positionality has to always be a part of the work, right, that you're doing in spaces, especially spaces that you don't belong to. And even if you think you belong, right, there's a way in which I always think about my own kind of Jamaican citizenship, that I have been absent largely from Jamaica, right, as a space for 21 years. And so when I go into that space, that it's always very important that I take into account what is happening on the ground, the people who are doing the work. I do not know more than they know, right? Like all I can do is to be a part of that. And so I think I can't imagine right now in this kind of abstract way what that could look like, because it depends on the communities that are on the ground. It depends on what needs to happen. But what I can say very largely is that folks, anybody who's going in, right, to kind of provide aid or to help in some way. And I think one has to really think about why and how you're doing that helping, that you have to think about your positionality, and you also have to really think about partnering with the local folks who are on the ground already doing the work, and not to assume that it's not happening or that it's not being done well, right? Because that's the other thing that we do, that we say it's not being done well. And so I think once people are on the ground doing the work, and there's always people, that we find ways to make ourselves useful without going in and taking over in this kind of, you know, like colonial way, right? It's another way of colonizing. I'll stop there.
I don't know if Dr. Joseph has an answer to the question, because I'm not an economist, but.
Well, not so much an answer, but in general observation, I mean, countries adjust their exchange rates as they see fit. And apparently the reason behind it is that banks in Haiti wanted to receive more US dollars. So they decided then to reduce the exchange. And of course it has an impact on remittances, because then people are getting less money for their dollar. And I know when that occurred, a lot of people were very upset about it. 106 was also very high, and maybe too high to sustain any kind of development. I recall when we used to get 15 gourds for $1. So to think that it went to 106 is really crazy. So the cost of living, though, continues to rise. People are getting fewer goods for their dollars, and the cost of living, food and, you know, goods, gasoline, all of that continues, you know, to stay at the rates they were before. So yes, it's a problem, and I'm not an economist either. So I'm not going to venture, you know, to say more than that. That definitely it impacts people when these rates are adjusted.
Yeah, and I think I would just you know, echo what you just said, Dr. Joseph, particularly the aspect of, right, that the cost of living hasn't changed, right? And that folks are experiencing that. And that speaks to other, you know, sort of neoliberal policies of the state rolling back and not controlling also, right, the price of food, and not having, right, control over what the private sector does, right? So I think that's, you know, that points to some other issues that we could probably just have a whole discussion on, just on that tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Faith Norton. Faith, would you like to pose your question?
Hi, good evening, everybody. So I really love sitting here for this talk. And it's nice to see two of my professors on the panel, so that's also really great. So the question I have is more about curriculum innovation. So this kind of is what Dr. Joseph talked about in her presentation, but I was thinking in this light, when we're thinking about the COVID pandemic and the disparities that it's increasing between generations, I was also thinking about how colonialism is still very prevalent and how different subjects are taught and how it's even taught in the Caribbean versus the US. So I wanted to panelists, what could they see being done? Some curricular changes or thoughts that you have on this idea, and maybe what can you see in the future to help move us away from these post-colonial techniques and moving to more global citizenship equity?
Mm.
Professor Joseph?
Well, definitely in, I think teachers and people who are teaching children of immigrant groups especially need to be aware of, you know, their students' cultures and take it into consideration. There are so many things that could be used and so many materials that could be developed that don't necessarily need to come from textbooks, but using the actual environment that children live in. I recall going to Tiguave, to a little rural school that a group of teachers were supporting, and talking to the kids, amazed about how much they knew in Creole about all the different kind of fishes in the area. and naming them. And yet, if you ask them a question in French, they were like silent. So why do this, to kids? Why not use the immediate environment that they're living in to enrich whatever concepts, you are supposed to be teaching? And so I think that a lot of the work has to be done by teachers themselves to be sensitive to those cultural elements, to be able to infuse them in their everyday teaching. So whether you're doing it, via distance learning in COVID times now that we have to use more technology, making use of what the children know, what they come to school with, and what you are building upon would make sense, for a good education. And then expanding as you go along to expose them to differences, different languages, different cultures, so that they get to know about other people. But I find immediate environment has a lot of the material, if you will, that you can build your curriculum upon. I recall one point in my career teaching a course on children of the Caribbean and the curriculum. And it was precisely to get teachers to focus on the cultures of their students, and it's, and stop saying, oh, they're all the same, I love them the same, and whatever I teach, I'm teaching them all the same and the same way. I mean, that kind of mentality cannot continue if you're going to have any kind of progressive education. So I would encourage definitely teachers to do that self-work of looking at yourself, looking at what you know about your own culture, and being able to be open to learning what you don't know if you're teaching in an environment where you don't know all the cultural norms.
Oh, thank you very much. So let me take this opportunity. I don't see any new questions coming up. Let me take this opportunity just to ask my colleagues a couple of questions. So I'll start with you, Professor Brown, about the response to COVID in Jamaica. So at one particular level, despite the fact that the numbers are low, economically it hit Jamaica particularly hard, because one of the things that Jamaica had to do was to basically close down travel to the island, and the tourism industry, which is a big source of revenue to Jamaica, got particularly hit. But you talked about opportunities, and you talked about resilience. I wanted you to talk a little about the way, even though, as you said, 23,000 might seem like a big crisis for Jamaica. Comparatively, it was low compared to Dominican Republic. It's low compared to what's happening in the United States and in Europe. I want you to talk a little about how, even in these spaces that are quote unquote seem peripheral from the capitalist center, people had resources and in some ways responded a little better than, for example, people in the United States in responding to COVID. So a little more, I want to hear your thoughts on that and how Jamaica responded to COVID. Second question, and this is to Professor Dougé-Prosper and Professor Joseph, in terms of the dialogue that both of you are having on education, because you're having a very interesting dialogue on education. The ideas in terms of policy alternatives that you put forward, you and your colleagues put forward, Professor Joseph, is fascinating, of how you put together and you construct a multilingual educational system. But the question that I want to ask, in a system which is heavily privatized, which is heavily marketized, what are the possibilities to actually see that policy through? What is the degree of the investment that the state has in such a policy? Because when you say policy, it's dependent on, it's reliant largely on what governments choose to do and how governments choose to use their resources. On the other end, Professor Dougé-Prosper, you're talking about education from below. It's privatized, it's not working. So what we at the grassroots are going to do is to take this process of education into our own hands, co-educate ourselves, offer a different vision of society. Interesting, but the role here, it's been facilitated by NGOs. NGOs can be part of what I call organic civil society, or NGOs can actually be extension of this capitalist society, which in itself is undercutting the state. Doesn't make what Professor Joseph wants to see possible happen. So your thoughts on that contradiction or those differences between coming from below, but yet being facilitated sometimes by people who have an interest in a privatized or more marketized form of education. So starting from Professor Kim, your thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I think in terms of the tourism, I was thinking about that as you talked about it, that even though the industry was impacted, the truth is that it probably didn't impact everyday Jamaicans, because tourism never impacts everyday Jamaicans, right? The money never makes it to the average Jamaican person because we don't own any of it, right? Like all of that a lot of people already know. So in that way, it impacted the rich folks, right? The whites owning folks who own all the hotels and blah, 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 all the industry, but not the average Jamaican citizen. I think in terms of response to COVID, it's really interesting. I mean, just on the ground, the kinds of things that I was hearing from folks, and I haven't been home, right? So I haven't seen this for myself, but friends, family, students, right, who have traveled back and forth since the year that we've been in COVID, what they've described is this really interesting government, like top-down, shutting down things, right? There are curfews, there's still a curfew that's in place in Jamaica as we speak. And so in that way, right, the government response is really, Trump's response was not a response at all. And in Jamaica, right, like it's draconian almost, right, in terms of the way in which the government is responding. And so in that way, there was a response. There was taking it seriously. There were people who were doing what they needed to do. But everyday average people, right, they were responding, I think, in similar ways to how we've seen people here, right? And for some people, it was because there was no choice. So I think about like public transportation, right? There are people for whom you're not moving around unless you're taking public transportation. And so there's no way to social distance in a taxi, right, with 4 other people or 5 other people. So even though there were rules around, right, how many people could ride in a car, well, the taxi driver needs to eat. And so, right, he's picking up more people than he needs to so he can generate fares. So all of these ways in which, right, even though the response from the government was almost draconian, it felt, the way I felt about it was almost insensitive to what was happening, right, with the average Jamaican person who needed to take public transportation or needed to be in these spaces and not have the opportunity to really social distance. So it begs the question, right, who can social distance? Who can, right, wear masks all the time, all day in this way, right? It didn't feel, however, the same as folks in the US who were just blatantly like, yes, I can do it, but I'm not going to do it because you're taking away my right. It wasn't that, right? It wasn't that kind of response. And so in that way, it was better. But there's also this way in which just the lack of sensitivity, I think, in some ways, made it really difficult for average everyday people to really be able to figure out how to live, how to stay afloat, right? How to just eat food every day. And so in that way, I think there could have been a different response, a way that perhaps together, the people and the government could have done something that was more sustainable. And I think that's why there are more numbers now. Like people are really worried about how high it's getting because, right, I think folks, the government, even though they responded in this really draconian way, it wasn't sensitive to what was really happening.
Prof. Dougé-Prosper, and then would round off with Prof. Joseph.
Sure. Well, actually, I'm glad you said that, right? Because this is one of the issues, and this is why I highlighted that in the snapshot, right? That folks attempting to do this work, right, have to contend with the way that the nonprofit industrial complex, right, the NGOization of social movements does very much what you're saying, Professor Rashid, right? Take away the heat from the state However, part of this particular process of putting together the notebook of demands was to be able to provide, you know, we could call it a policy brief, right? To provide clearly what these groups of folks, I think it was a total of 153 organizations that ended up producing the final product in 2018. But what happens, you know, and I think this is the same question that we gets connected to the one that you posed to Dr. Joseph. What happens when there is not a state that's able to respond to these demands, right? And this is part of why we've seen some, you know, this spilling out into forms of protest, right? That if I'm attempting all these ways to do your job and to bring for you, right, policies that we believe would come to support the way of life that we want and the kind of education that we want, and the state is not the appropriate interlocutor because it's busy doing other things or nothing, right? Then that means that, right, it spills onto the streets, right? It ends up doing that because it has nowhere else to be able to go and for these demands to become actual policy that reflects, right, peasants into the national imaginary and promotes a non-extractive form of development that turns peasants away from their land, but right, as workers for minimum wage and somebody else's factory, right? But if the state's plan is to do that, then it's incompatible with this notebook of demands. So this is part of one of the many explanations for the clash, if you will, that we're seeing today in the form of protesting against this current regime. So that's my answer, you know, with the concern that the groups do have about NGOs also, right, being a threat to making the state accountable, right, because they've come to play the role of the state in too many ways.
Thank you very much, Professor Joseph.
Yeah, so the situation in Haiti is that there are so many NGOs, and there's been an attempt by the government to regulate them, for them to register and all of that. But again, in a space where government is not taking its responsibility to fulfilling the requirement of providing for its citizens, you kind of, you know, allow for this kind of thing to grow out of proportion. In terms of schools, the schools are not NGOs, they're just private. And so again, the government is not able to provide sufficient numbers of schools for the numbers of children in Haiti right now. The population in Haiti has, you know, skyrocketed. It's close to 12 million now in the country. So when you're talking about, you know, providing schools, people who are able to afford or people who get remittances from their families are able to send their children to schools. And most of these schools tend to be Congregationist schools. So they're either affiliated with the Protestant church or the Catholic church, and some privates, but very few totally private that are non-religious based. So they already actually offer, you know, the kind of regional categories that I spoke about in terms of the national language, and even some of the private schools teach Creole. So it's interesting to see that private schools are teaching Creole, children are learning to read and write it, and yet in the public schools, we still have this refusal to accept the reality that Creole is a language, has an orthography, lots of books and materials published, but people will still say, you know, they don't want to learn the official orthography and all of that. So, so the kids who are being educated in Haiti, actually, by the time they finish secondary school, they are multilingual. Most educated Haitians already speak French, Spanish, and English. And then they know Creole and speak it, of course, but not all read and write it because they haven't been schooled in it. More recently, the additional language that's in the chart that I shared with you earlier is Portuguese. And again, because of the current impact of migration to Brazil. mostly for work-related efforts. So something like that is possible, and it already is happening in the private sector. And those of us who are thinking about the reality in Haiti is that it should be going on in the public sector as well, so that all children can benefit from this. In the world we live in today, we can't talk about, being unilingual. Everybody is at least bilingual, and in most places, bilingualism, lingualism is valued. And it's valued by middle class, it's valued by upper class, but for the poor, it's like you don't need to know another language. So those are the disparities that we're proposing that be dealt with. And again, the discussions have to occur. It's not, we don't think a government is going to be easily embracing something like that. But if you get a good minister of education who surrounds himself or herself with a group of people who are thinking about these things, then you can get some change. Because the privates are doing it already.
Yep. Thank you, Professor Joseph. I want to round up this conversation with the last contribution to the chat box from Patricia Brinto, to all the panelists and attendees, who wrote, "What an amazing group of panelists. The presentation was mind-blowing and full of aha moments." So my sentiments are the same like yours, Patricia. This is a conversation that can go on and on. Whenever VHP has asked me to participate in panels like this, I have enthusiastically, well, maybe a bit reluctantly said, okay, sign me in. But I've always tremendously enjoyed it, because if you put Haiti and the Caribbean, you're going to have a very rich conversation. You're going to have a very educative conversation, and that you don't want to end. Alas, we must close the discussion at this point. Let me turn to Lila Mead to give a final words and vote of thanks on this presentation. Over to you, Lila.
Hi everyone. So happy that we were able to bring these esteemed panelists together. Thank you, Carole. Thank you, Mamyrah. Thank you, Kim and Ismail, for your wonderful job in moderating the panel and bringing to light so many new ways of thinking. And one of the favorite quotes that I have is from Nelson Mandela, who says, "Education is the most powerful lesson you can use to change the world." And that's how we started the Vassar Haiti Project 20 years ago, funding a little school in a rural village in northern Haiti. And education is where it all starts. So thank you for educating us. And I'm just requesting 1 minute of a public service announcement. We're having an auction this month, I should say, and we're supporting Haitian artists. We're going to be selling over 100 paintings. So think about all the ramifications the ripple effect of how that affects families in Haiti at a time when tourists aren't going to buy art. So please visit our website. You can still get some really great deals and have a lot of fun. It's the Vassar Haiti Project, just Google that. And thank you all for coming. I look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody, for
Bye,
joining us
everybody.
tonight. Yeah.
All right, take care, everybody. Thanks so much.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.